So at 9:47 p.m. on a Tuesday night, the lights went out across New York State. Not a flicker, not a brownout, not a rolling reduction managed by grid operators, easing the system through a difficult night. No, this was a cascading failure that began at a switching station in Niagara County and ripped through the northeastern grid in just 11 minutes, plunging 22 million people into absolute darkness. The New York City subway stopped. Every train, every line. 722,000 passengers stranded underground or on platforms with nothing but emergency lighting. Hospitals across the state switched to generator power. Traffic signals went dark at 112,000 intersections. Cell towers began losing backup battery within the hour. Elevators stopped in buildings across Manhattan, including high-rises where elderly residents on upper floors had no way down and no way to call for help. And here is the part that turns a blackout into a political earthquake. The blackout did not happen because of a storm. It did not happen because of aging infrastructure. It did not happen because of an engineering failure, a cyber attack, or a natural disaster. It happened because 48 hours earlier, the President of the United States publicly threatened to seize Canadian hydroelectric infrastructure at Niagara Falls. And Canada responded by reducing water flow to the American side of the falls by 70%. The single largest source of electricity for upstate New York and a critical stabilizing input for the entire northeastern grid was throttled to a fraction of its capacity, and the grid, already strained to breaking under 7 weeks of Canadian energy suspension, did exactly what every engineer had warned it would do. It broke. Donald Trump broke his 11-day silence about Canada to make a threat about Niagara. Within 48 hours, that threat caused the largest blackout in New York State since 2003. Mark Carney's response was 3 sentences long and more devastating than any speech he had given. Warren Buffett called it the most predictable catastrophe in the history of American energy policy. And then he explained the principle that Trump violated, a principle so fundamental that any first-year business student could have prevented this. When you hear exactly what Trump said about Niagara, why his own Secretary of Energy resigned within hours of the threat, and what the grid collapse means for every American city that depends on Canadian power heading into winter, you will understand why this is not just the worst infrastructure failure of the crisis. It is the moment the crisis stopped being about politics and started being about survival. Let's begin with why Trump broke the silence. Because the 11 days of quiet were not voluntary and the decision to speak was not strategic. It was forced. The silence had held since Carney released diplomatic documents proving that Trump's narrative of Canada begging for mercy was fabricated. For 11 days, the White House said nothing about Canada. No tweets, no surrogates, no press conferences. The communications team had enforced the silence because every possible response to the documents led back to the National Economic Council memo, the internal assessment confirming that the administration knew the truth before it built the lie. The silence was humiliating, but the alternative of drawing more attention to the documents was worse. What broke the silence was not a political calculation. It was a phone call. The governor of New York, a Republican who had spent his career defending the administration, called the White House directly and told the chief of staff that the New York power grid was approaching critical failure. The Canadian energy suspension had eliminated 60% of the state's crude oil imports and virtually all of its imported hydroelectric power. The state had been managing the shortfall through emergency purchases from other states, accelerated use of natural gas reserves, and voluntary conservation programs, but the reserves were depleting. The emergency purchases were becoming more expensive as neighboring states faced their own shortfalls. And the one source of power that had been partially maintained through the crisis, Canadian hydroelectric flow through the Niagara system, was the only thing preventing the grid from tipping into cascading failure. The governor's message was blunt. If we lose Niagara Hydro, we lose the grid, not next month, this week. The chief of staff reportedly brought the message to Trump within the hour. And Trump's response, according to 3 people briefed on the conversation, was not to explore diplomatic options or to consider a quiet concession. It was then we take Niagara. It's ours anyway. The room went quiet. The Secretary of Energy, who was present, immediately outlined why seizure of national infrastructure was physically impossible without destroying the system's capacity. The National Security Advisor raised the treaty implications. The White House counsel warned of international legal exposure. 3 voices, engineering, security, law, all reaching the same conclusion. The threat could not be executed, and making it publicly would invite Canada to reduce flow further, accelerating the grid failure. Trump reportedly listened and then said, "I don't care about the treaty. The treaty doesn't keep the lights on in New York. Tell Canada we are taking it back." When the Secretary of Energy reiterated that taking it back would reduce power, not increase it, Trump dismissed her with 4 words. Then figure it out. The decision to go public was made within hours. The communications team, which had spent 11 days enforcing silence, now had to draft a statement for a policy that its own Secretary of Energy opposed, its own legal counsel questioned, and its own national security advisor had flagged as potentially constituting an act of aggression against a NATO ally. The statement went through 7 drafts in 4 hours. The final version was a masterpiece of aggressive ambiguity, threatening whatever steps are necessary without defining what those steps would be. But even the ambiguity could not disguise the core problem. The President of the United States was publicly threatening to seize infrastructure he did not understand, in violation of a treaty he had not read, dependent on water he did not control. To understand why that statement reflects a fundamental misunderstanding, you need to understand how Niagara Falls actually generates electricity. The physics of the system make Trump's threat not just aggressive, but physically impossible to execute without destroying the very power supply he was trying to secure. Niagara Falls sits on the border. The Niagara River flows from Lake Erie to Lake Ontario. The falls are split by Goat Island into the American Falls on the U.S. side and the Horseshoe Falls on the Canadian side. The Robert Moses Niagara Power Plant on the American side generates over 2,000 megawatts. The Sir Adam Beck stations on the Canadian side produce roughly the same. But here's the critical fact. The water that powers the American turbines does not come exclusively from the American side. The Niagara River's flow is governed by the 1950 Niagara Treaty, which allocates water between the two countries. Canada controls the upstream flow through the International Niagara Control Works, a series of gates and channels above the falls that regulate how much water reaches each side. The Canadian side controls the majority of the hydraulic head. Threatening to take Niagara is like threatening to seize the bottom of a waterfall, while someone else controls the top. The water comes from Canada. The elevation comes from geography. Neither can be seized by executive order. The two nations' power systems at Niagara are interconnected. You cannot separate the American side from the Canadian side without a physical restructuring that would take years and cost billions, and that would reduce the American side's generating capacity to a fraction of its current output. Trump went public with the threat at a press conference in the Roosevelt Room. The prepared remarks were 3 paragraphs long. The United States will no longer tolerate the weaponization of shared energy infrastructure by the Canadian government. Niagara Falls is American. The power it generates is American power, and the American government will take whatever steps are necessary, including the assertion of federal authority over all Niagara region energy infrastructure, to ensure that American families and American businesses have access to the power they need. We are directing the Department of Energy and the Army Corps of Engineers to prepare options for securing American energy independence at Niagara within 30 days. Every sentence contained a factual error. Niagara Falls is not American. It is binational. The power is not exclusively American. It is generated by water that flows from Canada through shared infrastructure. Asserting federal authority over Canadian sovereign property would be an act of territorial aggression. Within 90 minutes of the press conference, Secretary of Energy Dr. Sarah Mitchell, a career physicist who had served across 3 administrations, submitted her resignation. Her letter, published in full by the Washington Post, was a single page. The key passage read, "The President's statements regarding Niagara energy infrastructure reflect a fundamental misunderstanding of the binational nature of the system, the treaty obligations governing its operation, and the physical engineering constraints that make unilateral federal seizure both legally untenable and operationally destructive. I cannot in good conscience direct the Department of Energy to prepare options for an action that would, if executed, reduce American energy capacity at Niagara, rather than increase it. I have advised the President of this assessment. My advice was not taken. A sitting cabinet secretary publicly stating that the president's policy would achieve the opposite of its stated goal. In a normal administration, this would be the crisis of the year. But what came next was worse. Canada's response came 4 hours after Trump's press conference. Mark Carney did not appear at a podium. He did not address Parliament. He released a written statement, 3 sentences that the Canadian government simultaneously transmitted to every embassy, every foreign ministry, and every international news organization. The President of the United States has threatened to seize Canadian sovereign infrastructure. Canada will defend its sovereignty and its territory by all necessary means, effective immediately. Water flow through the International Niagara Control Works will be reduced to treaty minimum levels until the threat is formally and publicly withdrawn. 3 sentences. No rhetoric, no emotional appeal, pure operational communication. If you threaten our infrastructure, we throttle the water, cut the thread, and watch the power go off. The brevity was itself a message. Each Canadian response in the crisis had been shorter than the last, and each had been more devastating. The pattern communicated that Canada no longer needed to argue or persuade. What remained was mechanics. You threaten, we respond. Physics handles the rest. The human reality of the collapse defies clinical language. In New York City, 722,000 people were on the subway when the power failed. Trains stopped in tunnels. Emergency lighting activated dim battery-powered strips. Ventilation systems stopped. In late autumn, with temperatures dropping into the 30s, the tunnels became dangerously cold within hours. The MTA activated its emergency rescue protocols, evacuating passengers on foot, guided by transit workers with flashlights. The full evacuation took over 6 hours. Hospitals across the state switched to generator power, backup systems designed for 24 to 48 hours, not days. Within 12 hours, hospital administrators in 4 counties were requesting emergency fuel deliveries. One hospital administrator in Buffalo told a reporter, "We are running an intensive care unit on a diesel generator that was designed for a thunderstorm, not for the collapse of the state grid. Every hour we are on backup power is an hour closer to a decision no doctor should have to make." That quote was on every front page by morning. Elevators stopped in every building without backup power. In Manhattan alone, an estimated 14,000 people were trapped in elevators, many for hours. The New York City Fire Department responded to over 900 elevator rescue calls in a single night, more than it typically handles in 3 months. In high-rise buildings, elderly residents were stranded on upper floors, unable to descend, unable to cook, unable to charge medical devices, unable to call for help. Once cell towers began losing battery, the city's 311 system received over 2 million calls in the first 4 hours, overwhelming the system and producing busy signals for medical emergencies. The image that defined the night was taken by a Reuters photographer from the Canadian side of the border. In the foreground, Niagara Falls, illuminated by the lights of Niagara Falls, Ontario, still flowing, still beautiful, still generating power for the Canadian grid. In the background across the gorge, the American side, Niagara Falls, New York, completely dark, not a street light, not a window, nothing. 2 cities sharing the same waterfall, the same river, the same geography, one lit, one dark. The photograph was published without a caption. It did not need one. Warren Buffett's response addressed the structural fallacy at the heart of Trump's threat. He said, "In 70 years of business, I have learned that the single most dangerous thing a company can do is threaten its own supply chain. You can threaten a competitor. You can threaten a regulator. You can even threaten a customer, although I wouldn't recommend it. But threatening your supplier, the entity that provides something you need to operate, something you cannot replace, something your survival depends on, is an act of self-destruction so fundamental that I genuinely struggle to find a comparison." The United States depends on Canadian energy. Not metaphorically, not as a matter of convenience. Physically, the electrons that power New York City, that light hospitals, that run the subway, that keep 22 million people's homes functional, a significant share of those electrons originate in Canada. When you depend on someone for something that fundamental, you do not threaten them. You do not make demands. You certainly do not threaten to seize their infrastructure because they have the one thing you cannot counter, the off switch. And they just used it. Buffett continued, "Every negotiation textbook will tell you the same thing. Leverage requires alternatives. If you want to negotiate hard with a supplier, you need another supplier. If you want to pressure someone who provides your energy, you need another source of energy." The United States has spent decades building an energy relationship with Canada based on the assumption that the relationship was permanent, that the power would always flow, the oil would always ship, the gas would always arrive. They never built alternatives because they never imagined they would need them. And now they are discovering what every business learns eventually. Dependency without diversification is not a relationship. It is a vulnerability, and vulnerabilities do not care about your press conferences. They do not care about your executive orders. They do not care about your threats. They only care about physics. And physics this week turned the lights off in New York. Buffett's closing was a single line that distilled the entire crisis. You cannot bully your electricity into existence. The fallout is no longer cascading. It is compounding. Each week's consequences create the conditions for the next week's consequences. The spiral is accelerating because the underlying cause, the energy suspension, remains unresolved, and the underlying demand, Canada's insistence that the United States withdraw the resignation demand, remains unmet. The grid collapse shattered what remained of Republican unity. The New York congressional delegation, 8 Republican members, issued a joint statement calling for the immediate and unconditional withdrawal of the demand for Carney's resignation. Their statement read, "Our constituents are in the dark. Their hospitals are on generators. Their children are cold, and the cause is a demand that no sovereign democracy will ever accept, the demand that another country change its leader because our president finds that leader inconvenient." The Pentagon quietly informed the White House that the Army Corps of Engineers would not participate in any planning related to the seizure of binational infrastructure at Niagara. Senior defense officials stated that any military or federal action to assert control over infrastructure governed by the 1950 Niagara Treaty would constitute a violation of international treaty obligations, potentially an act of aggression against a NATO ally. The military was not merely advising against the threat, it was refusing to execute it. International reaction focused on the president. A European diplomat put it this way: If the United States does not respect treaty-governed shared infrastructure with Canada, its closest ally, its largest trading partner, its most integrated neighbor, then no treaty-governed infrastructure anywhere in the world is safe from American unilateral action. That is not a Canada problem. That is a global problem. So here is where we stand. Donald Trump broke 11 days of silence to threaten the seizure of Canadian hydroelectric infrastructure at Niagara Falls. Infrastructure he does not control, governed by a treaty he did not read, dependent on water that originates in Canada. His own Secretary of Energy resigned within hours, stating publicly that the threat would reduce American power rather than secure it. Canada reduced water flow to treaty minimum levels. 48 hours later, the New York State grid collapsed, plunging 22 million people into darkness. The governor addressed the state and said, "The laws of physics do not care about press conferences." The military informed the White House it would not execute the seizure. 8 Republican members of Congress called for the unconditional withdrawal of the demand for Carney's resignation, and Warren Buffett explained that dependency without diversification is a vulnerability, and vulnerabilities are settled by physics, not politics. Can the grid be stabilized before winter arrives in full force, with Niagara at 30% capacity, no Canadian imports, and no diplomatic channel open to negotiate their restoration? Can the military's refusal to plan the seizure survive political pressure from a White House that has overruled every institution that has stood in its way? Can the alliance survive when the United States is threatening to seize treaty-governed shared infrastructure with the nation that was, until 8 weeks ago, its closest partner on Earth? And the question that 22 million New Yorkers answered personally in the dark. What happens when a president who has never understood the difference between strength and control discovers that he is dependent on a country he has been trying to bully into submission, and that the country, quietly, precisely, without a single speech, in 3 sentences, can turn his lights off? What happens when the most powerful nation in the world discovers that power and electricity are not the same thing, that one is a political concept and the other is a physical necessity, and that the physical necessity does not care how powerful you think you are? Trump tried to bully Canada into restoring power. Instead, he proved that Canada controls the switch. He tried to demonstrate American strength at Niagara. Instead, he demonstrated American dependence. He tried to break his silence with a show of force. Instead, he broke New York's grid, and somewhere in the dark, with 22 million people waiting for the lights to come back on, the photograph circled the world. The Canadian side of Niagara Falls glowing, the American side black. Same waterfall, same river, same night. One side lit by the power it controls. The other side dark, because it forgot that power is not something you demand. It is something you earn, something you share, something you respect. And when you do not respect it, when you threaten the hand that feeds the grid, the switch is not yours to flip. It never was. Please hit the bell icon and subscribe to my channel for daily updates.